Wesley So uses creative tactics in the Sicilian Rouser in our game today. From 2007, his opponent is Mark Paragua, also a Filipino grandmaster. And this game, like all Sicilian Rousers, is really full of very interesting and combative chess. I think you're going to enjoy it. Wesley So has the white pieces, Mark Paragua has black. E4, C5, the Sicilian defense is on the board. Knight F3, D6, D4. Knight F6, Knight C3. And in this position, where black can play a knight or for a dragon, Mark Paragua chooses knight to C6, which is known as the classical Sicilian. And the most aggressive and most common response is the response played by Wesley So, bishop to G5, or the Rouzer Sicilian, putting immediate pressure on this knight and threatening to weaken the pawn structure. So E6 is played, so that does not happen, but it does temporarily create a pin on the F6 knight. Queen to D2 to clear the way for queenside castling. A6 to keep a knight out of B5, but also black can expand with B5 himself later in the game. Long castling and H6, pushing the bishop away. Bishop E3 is the choice of Wesley So. Now bishop to E7 and F4. This is a very common structure for white against the Sicilian defense. He can choose to play E5 in some positions, or even F5 and gain space and open things up in the middle of the board. Black takes on D4. It's not the only option. You could also play bishop to D7, but one of the issues is this knight can become very tricky. So you get that knight off the board immediately. Bishop D4 and now B5, gaining space on the queen side. Now queen to E3 is played. This is a very dangerous move. Black has to be very careful here. He's clearing the way for this rook on D1 to aim at the queen. So right now the move E5 is a very serious threat. It would open up that D file. But also at some point you might be able to play bishop to B6 now, harassing the queen even further. Queen to E3, a strong move. Queen to C7 to step out of the line of attack from that rook at D1. And now E5, jumping ahead and gaining that space right in the center of the board. Black is not castled yet. Pawn takes, and here it would be a mistake to take with the bishop, actually. It looks like a strong move, right? You're gaining a tempo against the queen on C7. The reason it's not really a good move is this response, knight to G4. This hits white's queen as well as the bishop, and the dark squared bishop would come off the board, or the queen's would, and white would sort of lose the initiative. So instead, Wesley So takes with the pawn. And this pawn is very powerful, gains a lot of space on the board, kicks this knight at F6 away. The only problem is, after knight to D7, as was played in the game, there are some weak light squares in white's position, and there is pressure on the C5 pawn. So that means that white has to strike quickly. If he lets black consolidate, black might have a pretty good position here. So he plays knight to E4 immediately, threatening to jump into D6, deliver check. Obviously, the D6 square is quite weak with that pawn on E5 supporting it. Bishop to B7, threatening to just take that knight off the board. So Wesley So jumps in with knight to D6 check. Now, you don't want to move the king and lose the right to castle. It looks like bishop takes D6 then is the right move, but this actually is a blunder because a pawn takes bishop, and if the queen retakes, then bishop takes G7, which is a double attack. The rook attacks the queen, the bishop attacks the rook, and black would basically be lost here. So then how do you deal with this knight to D6 check? Well, it's really quite interesting. It's a bit of an optical illusion. Black takes the knight with the queen. Looks like he's just losing his queen. But this has been played actually a number of times. After pawn takes queen, as was played in the game, bishop to G5. That's the trick. That's what makes that move work. And the bishop pins the queen on E3 to the king and keeps the material fairly equal. Queen takes G5, HG5, keeps it completely equal. But now bishop G7. So white does gain a pawn, and that hits the rook. Rook goes to H4. Now, in this position, white is up a pawn and has the two bishops, but his pawns are a bit scattered. Black has a pretty nice, compact position right here. It's playable for black. The bishop goes back to D4, and rook to C8 has been played in this position in the past. F5 seems to be a fairly strong move also, preparing black to play E5 and just advance those central pawns. But Grandmaster Paragua in this position plays F6. A little bit safer, I think, a little more solid, and keeping some control over the E5 square. Bishop goes to F2. rook to h6, and here Wesley So plays h4. And he has a very interesting idea. After king to f7, his idea is rook to h3. And with this pawn defending the rook, he's threatening to take on g5 himself and wreck Black's pawn structure. The solidity of this structure is one of the strengths of Black's position. So he wants to take on g5. Now gh4 is played. Now computers really like this move, rook to c3, penetrating to c7, but Wesley So has an interesting concept. He plays the move g3. Now that removes a target from this bishop, but it also creates, a pin on the h-file, and in doing so, after e5, pawn takes, Wesley So has created an outside passed pawn. So he has the two bishops, an extra pawn, and that pawn is passed on the h-file. Rook to c8, a4, attacking Black's queenside structure. The pawn advances to b4, now b3, and f5. So Black's counterplay essentially is going to revolve around these e and f pawns. He wants to mobilize those pawns. What Wesley So wants to do is slow those pawns down, neutralize them, and advance his own h-pawn. That's sort of the battle in this position. Bishop c4 check was played. Now Black can play king f6, but after h5, the rook comes to g1, keeping the king away from the pawn, and he can just slowly advance that h-pawn. So because of that, Grandmaster Paragua plays an exchange sacrifice. He gives up a rook for the bishop at c4. After pawn takes rook, he has created all sorts of pawn weaknesses on White's queenside. Now we'll see if that's enough to justify the expense of a rook. f4 advances. Obviously, again, we talked about how these pawns are his key to success. c5, bishop to c6. Black blockades the c-pawn and also attacks the pawn on a4, so Wesley So advances that pawn to a5. King to e6 and now h5. That pawn moves up one square. King to f5. That helps advance these pawns, and maybe he can come over and assist in capturing the h-pawn. And Black's position, even though he's down in exchange, does have some danger to it. Rook to g1 controls the g-file, keeps the king out. Now e4. The pawns continue to advance. Now Wesley So plays rook to f1. And the idea, of course, is if Black plays e3, then just bishop takes e3. And the pawn can't take the bishop because it's pinned against the king. So he's stopping the advance of those pawns. So Grandmaster Paragua plays bishop to b5, attacking that rook directly. But instead of moving that rook, let's say he plays rook f to h1, then e3, knight to c5. Here Black has real counterplay. This is probably an equal endgame. So Wesley So leaves the rook at f1, but now c6. The idea is to either allow him to take the rook or distract the bishop. But knight to e5, Black ignores the pawn, but now c7. And that pawn is only one square away from queening. Rook to h8 is played to control the queening square, and then bishop to d4. Pins that knight against the rook, and f3. And if you look at this position, obviously you still can't play here because the bishop would take because of the pin. If you look at this position after f3, you'll notice Wesley So has established complete control over the dark squares, keeping Black from advancing these pawns. He's got a passed pawn on h5, d6, and c7. And after rook to g1, the king cannot cross over to the g-file, and this pawn is almost impossible to stop. So in this position, Mark Paragua resigned. A really great display of how to play the Rauzer against the classical Sicilian. Even after going over this great game from Wesley So, there is still some great chess that you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the video you are going to want to watch is right here. So be sure to check that out for some amazing chess. Goodbye.